Steve Harvey was standing center stage, doing what he does best, making an entire studio laugh until their sides hurt. He'd just delivered one of his signature reactions to a contestant's ridiculous answer, something about bringing a llama to a wedding, and the audience was roaring. His timing was perfect, his energy infectious, and he was about to land the punchline that would take the laughter to another level. But then he stopped, mid-sentence, mid-gesture, mid-everything. The smile faded from his face. His eyes locked onto something in the audience that didn't belong in this room, full of joy. Something that made Steve Harvey, a man who'd been performing for over 40 years, forget every word he was about to say. It was Thursday, May 18th, 2023, at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta. The Thompson family from Charlotte, North Carolina, was competing against the Nguyen family from Houston, Texas. Both families had brought incredible energy, and the game was tied going into the final round. Everything was going exactly as it should. The producers were happy. The audience was engaged. Steve was in his element. But in row 7, seat 12, something was happening that would change everything. An elderly man, probably in his early 80s, was sitting perfectly still while everyone around him laughed and clapped. His hands were folded in his lap. His eyes were closed, and tears were streaming down his weathered face. Steve's comedian instincts, the ones that had carried him through decades of stand-up, talk shows, and game show hosting, told him to keep going. The show must go on. There were producers to satisfy, commercial breaks to hit, and a rhythm to maintain. But something deeper, something human, made him stop. The studio audience began to notice the shift. The laughter died down. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone sensed that something unscripted was happening. "Hold on, everybody," Steve said, his voice gentle, but carrying across the studio with unmistakable authority. "Just hold on for a second." Steve set down his cards on the podium and walked directly toward row 7. The production assistant looked confused. The director started signaling from a booth, but Steve ignored every professional protocol he'd ever learned. What the cameras didn't know, what nobody in that studio knew yet, was that 82-year-old Harold Mitchell had been sitting in that seat, carrying the weight of 63 years of love, loss, and a promise he'd made to his wife that very morning. Steve Harvey had seen a lot in his years hosting Family Feud. He'd seen people faint from excitement, cry from winning, and occasionally get so overwhelmed they couldn't speak. But this was different. The way this elderly man sat so still, so dignified in his grief, while joy exploded around him. It was like watching someone drowning in silence while the world danced. Steve reached row 7 and knelt down in front of the old man, getting to his eye level despite the cameras, despite the audience, despite everything that television told him to do. "Sir," Steve said quietly, though the microphone still picked up his words. "Are you all right?" Harold Mitchell opened his eyes slowly. They were pale blue, faded by time, but still sharp with intelligence and something else, a depth of sorrow that made Steve's heart clench. "I'm sorry," Harold said, his voice trembling. "I shouldn't be crying. This is supposed to be happy." "No, sir," Steve said firmly. "You cry if you need to cry. Can you tell me your name?" "Harold. Harold Mitchell." "Harold, I'm Steve, and I want you to know something. You don't have to apologize for feeling what you're feeling. Can you tell me what's going on?" The studio was completely silent now. 200 people holding their breath, waiting. Harold looked at Steve, then at the stage, then back at Steve. When he spoke, his voice was stronger than anyone expected. "My wife died this morning." The collective gasp from the audience echoed through the studio. Several people in the front rows brought their hands to their mouths. Steve felt his throat tighten, but he didn't move. He stayed right there, kneeling in front of this man who had just lost everything. "Mr. Harold," Steve said gently, "I'm so sorry. Can I ask, why are you here? Why did you come today?" Harold reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands and pulled out a worn piece of paper. It was a printed email confirmation, the kind you get when you're selected to be in a studio audience. "We got this letter 6 months ago," Harold said, unfolding it carefully. "Grace, that's my wife. Grace loved your show. She watched it every single night. When we found out we were selected to be in the audience, she cried happy tears for the first time in 3 years. Steve's eyes were filling now, but he let Harold continue. Grace had pancreatic cancer, Harold said, his voice steady despite the tears. The doctors told us in January that she had maybe 6 months. She made me promise her something. She made me promise that no matter what happened, if she didn't make it to May, I would still come. She said she wanted someone from our family to see the show for her. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The studio was dead silent, except for the sound of people crying. Harold continued, his words coming faster now, as if he'd been holding them in too long. Grace died at 4:47 this morning. She held my hand, and her last words to me were, "Harold, you better not miss that show. You promised me. You go and you laugh for both of us." Steve Harvey, the man who had built a career on never being at a loss for words, couldn't speak. He just reached out and took Harold's hand. "So I got dressed," Harold said, his voice breaking. "I called our daughter and told her. I kissed Grace goodbye, and I drove here because I made her a promise. But I got in this seat, and everybody was laughing, and I couldn't." Steve squeezed Harold's hand tighter. Behind the scenes, producers were panicking, wondering how to handle this, whether to cut to commercial, whether to stop filming. But Steve Harvey made a decision that went against every television convention. He stood up slowly, helping Harold to his feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced to the entire studio, his voice thick with emotion, "this is Mr. Harold Mitchell. He lost his wife, Grace, this morning. She was the love of his life for 63 years. And he came here today because he made her a promise that he would laugh for both of them." The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual game show applause. This was different. This was people standing, crying, honoring a man's devotion and a woman's final wish. But Steve wasn't finished. "Harold," he said, turning back to the elderly man, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you think Grace would want you to sit in that seat crying?" Harold managed a small smile through his tears. "No, sir. She'd tell me to stop being a sad sack and enjoy the show." Steve laughed, and the audience laughed with him. Not at Harold, but with him in solidarity with his grief and his love. "That's what I thought," Steve said. "So here's what we're going to do. You're not going to sit in that audience anymore. You're going to come up on this stage with me." The audience erupted again, but Harold looked confused and panicked. "Mr. Steve, I can't. I'm just an old man. I don't know anything about game shows." "Harold," Steve said, his voice gentle but firm, "your wife loved this show for 63 years. You loved her for 63 years. That makes you more qualified than anyone to be on this stage today." Steve helped Harold walk down from the audience seating, supporting his elbow as they climbed the steps to the Family Feud stage. The Thompson and Nguyen families watched in reverent silence, understanding that they were witnessing something much bigger than a game. When they reached center stage, Steve did something unprecedented. He turned to both competing families. "Thompson family, Nguyen family, I need to ask you something. Would you mind if we did something a little different today?" Both families nodded immediately. The Thompson patriarch, a man in his 50s, spoke up. "Steve, you do whatever Mr. Harold needs." Steve smiled and turned back to Harold, who was standing in the middle of the stage looking overwhelmed and small despite his tall frame. "Harold, I want you to play a special round of Family Feud for Grace," Steve said. "I'm going to ask you questions, and you're going to answer them. But here's the thing, you're not playing for money. You're playing for something much more important." Harold looked confused. "What am I playing for?" "You're playing to keep a promise," Steve said simply. "You promised Grace you'd laugh today, so we're going to make sure you do." What happened next became the most beautiful 30 minutes in Family Feud history. Steve abandoned the traditional format entirely. He didn't use the board. He didn't keep score. Instead, he asked Harold questions about his life with Grace. "Harold, tell me something that Grace did that always made you laugh." Harold thought for a moment, and then a genuine smile broke through his grief. "She couldn't cook to save her life. Every Thanksgiving for 63 years, she burned the turkey. Every single year. And every single year, I'd tell her it was delicious, and she'd say, 'Harold Mitchell, you're a terrible liar and I love you for it.' The audience laughed, and Steve laughed with them. Sounds like Grace had you figured out. From day one, Harold agreed, and for a moment, the grief lifted from his face. Steve continued gently, weaving questions about Grace's life through the conversation. Harold talked about how they'd met at a church picnic in 1960, how she'd worn a yellow dress and told him he had nice shoes, how he'd been so nervous he'd spilled lemonade all over those nice shoes, how she'd laughed and told him she liked it better clumsy and honest than smooth and fake. He talked about their wedding day, when it rained so hard the ceremony had to be moved inside, and Grace had said the rain was good luck because it meant heaven was crying happy tears. He talked about their daughter Caroline, born in 1962, and how Grace had been the kind of mother who turned every scraped knee into an adventure and every bad day into a treasure hunt for silver linings. He talked about the 43 years Grace worked as a second-grade teacher, coming home exhausted every night, but lighting up whenever she talked about her students. And with every story, Harold's voice grew stronger. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but now it was sharing space with love, with memory, with the celebration of a life fully lived. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Steve reached into his jacket and pulled out his personal business card. Harold, I want you to have this. This has my assistant's direct number on it. I want you to call her tomorrow. Harold looked confused. Why would I do that? Because, Steve said, his voice breaking slightly, I'm going to make sure that every year on this date, May 18th, you have tickets to Family Feud. Not in the audience. On this stage. Because Grace loved this show, and you love Grace, and that means you're family now. The audience gave Harold a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. But Steve had one more thing to do. He walked over to both competing families. Thompson family and Gwynn family. Today you didn't compete against each other. Today you witnessed something sacred. You saw what 63 years of love looks like. You saw what keeping a promise means. And I think both families deserve to win today. Both families received the maximum prize money that day. But more importantly, they received something that money couldn't buy. They've been part of a moment that reminded everyone watching what really matters. After the taping, Harold sat in Steve's dressing room, drinking coffee and looking at the business card in his hands. Why did you do all this? Harold asked quietly. You don't even know me. Steve sat down across from him. Harold, I've been doing this job for a long time. I've given away a lot of money, made a lot of people laugh, created a lot of television moments. But the truth is, most days I go home and wonder if any of it really matters. If it makes any real difference in the world. Steve paused, collecting his thoughts. But today, you reminded me what matters. You showed me what love looks like when it's tested by the hardest thing life can throw at us. You kept a promise to your wife, even though it was probably the hardest thing you've ever done. That's the kind of man I want to be. That's the kind of moment I want to create. So thank you, Harold. Thank you for coming today. Harold's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different tears. Grace would have loved you, he said simply. I wish I could have met her, Steve replied. You did, Harold said. She was here today. In every laugh, in every story. She was here. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, the response was overwhelming. The clip of Harold's moment was shared over 150 million times in the first week. But more importantly, it sparked something beautiful. Thousands of people began sharing their own stories of lost loved ones and kept promises. The hashtag for Grace trended worldwide, with people posting about the promises they'd made to people they'd lost and the lengths they'd gone to keep them. A widow in Nebraska shared how she'd completed her husband's bucket list after he died, visiting every national park they'd planned to see together. A son in California posted about finishing his mother's unfinished novel and getting it published in her name. A daughter in Maine talked about running the marathon her father never got to complete because of his illness. The Family Feud offices were flooded with letters from viewers who said Harold's story had given them permission to grieve openly, to honor their loved ones publicly, and to find joy even in the midst of profound loss. But perhaps the most beautiful response came from Harold himself. True to his word, Steve Harvey made sure Harold received tickets to Family Feud every May 18th. In 2024, Harold returned with his daughter Caroline and his 3 grandchildren. When he walked onto that stage, the entire studio gave him a standing ovation before Steve had even introduced him. "Mr. Harold," Steve said, embracing the old man like family. "How are you doing?" "I'm living, Steve," Harold replied with a smile that reached his eyes. "Grace would want me to be living." During that taping, Harold shared something that made even the hardest-hearted crew members tear up. In the years since Grace's death, he'd started a support group at his church for widows and widowers. He called it Grace's Circle, and every week, people who'd lost their spouses would gather to share stories, cry together, laugh together, and remind each other that grief and joy could coexist. Grace spent her whole life teaching second graders how to be brave and kind, Harold explained. "So, I figure I should spend whatever time I have left teaching grown-ups the same thing. That you can be sad and still choose to show up. That you can miss someone and still celebrate them. That love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes shape." Steve Harvey had to turn away from the camera for a moment, overcome with emotion. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Today, Harold Mitchell is 84 years old. He still comes to Family Feud every May 18th, now accompanied by an ever-growing group of members from Grace's Circle. The support group has expanded to 6 other churches in the Charlotte area, helping hundreds of people navigate the impossible grief of losing a life partner. Steve Harvey established the Grace Mitchell Memorial Scholarship, providing full college tuition for children who've lost a parent to cancer. To date, the scholarship has helped over 200 students pursue their education, each one carrying Grace's legacy of turning hardship into hope. The business card Steve gave Harold that day sits framed in Harold's living room, next to a photo of Grace in her yellow dress from their first meeting in 1960. Harold looks at it every morning and remembers the promise he kept and the unexpected family he found in the process. The episode featuring Harold's story has been viewed over 300 million times across all platforms, making it one of the most watched game show moments in internet history. But the view count isn't what matters. What matters is the thousands of messages from people who said Harold's courage inspired them to honor their own lost loved ones with joy instead of just sorrow. Steve Harvey says that the day he met Harold Mitchell changed how he approaches every episode, every contestant, every moment he spends on that stage. "I used to think my job was to entertain people," Steve said in a later interview. "But Harold taught me that my real job is to create space for people to be fully human, to cry when they need to cry, to laugh when they need to laugh, to honor the people they've loved and lost. That's not entertainment, that's ministry." Harold Mitchell came to Family Feud to keep a promise to his dying wife. What he didn't know was that keeping that promise would create a ripple effect of love, healing, and connection that continues to spread to this day. Grace Mitchell never got to see Family Feud in person, but her legacy lives on in every person who's been touched by Harold's story. In every widow who finds the courage to laugh again. In every widower who realizes grief and gratitude can coexist. In every child who loses a parent, but still finds a way forward because someone believed in them enough to invest in their future. And somewhere, Harold likes to think, Grace is watching all of it unfold with that same smile she wore in the yellow dress back in 1960. The smile that told him from day one that love was the only promise worth keeping, and the only legacy worth leaving behind. Steve Harvey thought he was just hosting a game show that day. Harold Mitchell thought he was just keeping a promise to his wife. What they actually did was remind millions of people around the world that the most powerful force in human existence is love. Not romantic love alone, but the kind of love that shows up even when showing up is the hardest thing you'll ever do. The kind of love that drives an 82-year-old man to sit in a studio audience on the same day his wife dies because he made her a promise. The kind of love that makes a game show host stop everything and create space for grief to transform into celebration. The kind of love that turns a television moment into a movement, a story into a legacy, and a promise into a purpose that touches thousands of lives. Harold Mitchell taught us that strength isn't about not feeling pain. It's about feeling all the pain and choosing to honor love anyway. And Steve Harvey proved that sometimes the most important thing you can do with a platform isn't to entertain. It's to witness, to honor, and to remind people that their love, their loss, and their promises matter more than any prize money or television moment ever could. If this incredible story of love, loss, and unbreakable devotion moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that grief and gratitude can coexist and that kept promises are the most powerful legacy we can leave. Have you ever kept a promise to someone you lost? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing, true stories about the power of love and the courage to honor it.